What's up, everybody? Appreciate you being here. Wanted to let you know before we get into the show, there's a couple of easy ways that you can help me with it. With ideas, problems, solutions to whatever you find interesting, anything from a word to an essay, just send it to me. Through the comment section, wherever you listen, on Instagram or Twitter, I'm on both at The Best Idea, or straight to the email, bestideapodcast@gmail.com. Or you can support it in other ways. You can rate it wherever you listen it to. That's probably the easiest. Subscribing to the YouTube page is very helpful. The most direct way is Patreon. Patreon.com/thebestidea. $1 a month just to show some support. If you do $3 a month, you'll get early access to the Stop the Presses episodes. You sign up once, you don't have to think about it again. Really appreciate your time. And here we go. Welcome back, everybody. Best Idea Podcast. Stop the Presses episode today. It's going to be a little bit different than I normally do. Usually when we do Stop the Presses, we're going through a series of different articles about just any various thing that I find over the weeks. But today, going to be kind of centered on articles about one thing, and it is this. I thought, or I have thought, most of my life, look, everybody's good at something. Right? Countries are good at something. They're famous for different things. What do you have? Belgium got great waffles, I understand. The United States, we are famous for, what do we have the most of? Guns, spam emails, Puerto Rico, rum, right? Brazil, they export a lot of sugar. Greece is known for what? Cheese, Mediterranean dishes. North Korea, probably most famous for making threats. The list goes on. Everybody's got something. I thought Russia's thing was fighting, or like war, but just fighting generally. I mean, it's fucking Russia, right? I mean, as much as we associate Colombia with cocaine, you associate Russia with fighting, and you'd have a lot of reason to do that historically. I mean, if you look back, we're talking about the country that was on, the winning side of some of the greatest battles of World War II. I'm thinking about Stalingrad, for example. This is a battle between Russians and Germans where, they have 4 million people fighting? Something like that? Between both sides, something like 2 million deaths, and they came out on top. Russians historically are known for fighting. Remember the story of when Napoleon tried to invade and when Hitler tried to invade. But Napoleon goes in, gets to Moscow or close to it, and thinks he's won. But what the Russians are actually doing is they're just retreating on purpose, and they're burning everything as they go and allowing Napoleon to get further and further into Russia. Because the winter there is brutal. Look at where Russia is on a map. It's way in the north. The whole place is fucking cold. So they just back off, burn everything as they go. And then eventually the French are just stuck. They have to retreat. And I think half of them died in retreat. So you can count that as a win. But it's not the only example. It goes back, Russia's an extremely old country. They fought a war in the 1800s against Persia. Now it's Iran. Something like 2,300 or so Russian soldiers fight 30,000 Persian troops in the middle of the night, and they slaughtered them. The battle was called Aslandus. It was in October, like 1811, 1812, somewhere in there. 30,000 on 2,300. And they win that fight. Russians are good at fighting. They're supposed to be really good at fighting. They had wars with, they've had wars with Japan and China. They fought Sweden. They've won some, they've lost some, but they've maintained, they've left intact that idea that they could fight. They could fight. Not only that, like down to an individual level. I mean, if you do or don't pay attention to combat sports, especially if you do, there's no way you can ignore some of the greatest fighters of all time, of any weight, are Russian. I mean, just recently, you've got in the UFC, you've got Khabib Nurmagomedov, okay, which he comes from Dagestan, which is a province of Russia. Matter of fact, it's right by Chechnya, which also tried to fight a war against Russia and got completely obliterated. Granted, not really a fair fight, and their capital was completely destroyed in the midst of it, but they gave it a go. Again, a Russian victory. But Khabib Nurmagomedov, he fought at lightweight, so 155 pounds in the UFC for several years, and he retired undefeated, 29-0, and he's famous because he barely lost a round. He might have lost a round or two, but it's debatable. Either way, to have a run like he did at a very, very dangerous weight class, 155 pounds, is known to be the deepest, most talented division in mixed martial arts, really. And the UFC being the premier organization, this guy went undefeated and just absolutely fucking mauled everybody he fought. Didn't matter who it was, what their style was. He just went in and destroyed them. And they've got videos of him when he was young wrestling bears. His dad was very influential in his life and had him preparing to be this kind of combat warrior forever. Comes from Russia. Why? Because Russia's really good at fighting. Shit, they came up with their own fighting style called Sambo. This is something that Khabib became really proficient at and won several titles in, national titles. It's got wrestling in it. It's got judo in it. It's a brutal way to fight. It's a very tough way to fight. If you've ever seen judo or any sort of discipline like that, the throws are they're amazing, but they're absolutely brutal when you're on the receiving end of them. You have a guy named Alexei Olnik. He's a little bit lesser known. I think he still fights in the UFC as well. He's a heavyweight. This guy is incredible. I've seen him get taken down to the ground by another fighter, and as he's laying on his back, he can wrap his arms around his opponent and choke him out from his back. It's amazing. If you have never been in a fight or never practiced combat sports of any kind, just lay on your back and try and do anything against anybody. It's a real pain in the ass. This guy is amazing. His jiu-jitsu is amazing. His Sambo is also amazing, named Alexei Olnik. And lest I forget, one of the greatest fighters ever in MMA history, the heavyweight Fedor Emelianenko. They called him the last emperor. This guy was so badass. I mean, he still kind of fights. He's older now, but he's so badass that the Japanese fans he had, he's Russian, but the Japanese fans that he had nicknamed him the Last Emperor. So if you know anything about Japan and their like cultural history, very conservative society, very they show a lot of reverence to their ancestors. To give that title to somebody who's not even Japanese is pretty remarkable. It shows you the level that this guy was at. When he would go to Japan, he would sell out arenas. And if you haven't seen Fedor fight, it's Fedor, YouTube this guy. To say a wrecking machine, unstoppable. He was always the smaller fighter because he fought at heavyweight. I think he's like 6 foot. A lot of the guys he was fighting is 6'1", 6'3". Fought a guy who was 6'7", Sammy Schilt, and weighed less a lot of times. He was kind of like Mike Tyson in that way. He weighed like 210, 215, maybe 220. A lot of the guys he's fighting, 230, 250. And he would just fucking destroy them. I mean, he had some back and forths, some really good fights with like Crow Cop and Nogueira. But all in all, I mean, just an absolute destructive force when he would get in the cage or the ring or wherever he was fighting. I mean, they have documentaries about the guy, about his calm under pressure. There's this really famous video. He fought a guy named Kevin Randleman. Well, Kevin Randleman was this amazing wrestler. He picks Fedor up over his head, gets airborne with him, and slams him down directly on his neck. Like his head bent up, like his chin's going into his chest, slammed him down on the back of his head, and his neck bent like a pretzel. And he immediately reverses the position, gets on top of Kevin Randleman, and submits him by almost breaking his arm. I mean, within seconds. Within seconds. The guy was incredible. If you've never seen him fight, you should. Another Russian. And his brother fights. Alexander Emelianenko. Also a fighter. And the list goes on. I mean, there's another guy in the UFC named Volkov, Alexander Volkov. He hasn't been a champion or anything, but he's incredible as well. He's had a lot of really great fights. Fought Alistair Overeem and a lot of guys. They have a history of winning fights, not only on a national level, but individually. And the question is, what happened? So this fight in Ukraine, actually, let me take it back. Not only do they have a history of fighting these wars, they also hold fucking grudges. So there's a peace treaty being discussed right now to officially end the war between Russia and Japan, like World War II, which ended in 1945 for the rest of us. Japan and Russia still haven't forgiven each other. Russia still holds a grudge against Japan. So this is the country that's been on stage for the last, 4 or 5 weeks since they launched this invasion of Ukraine. So Ukraine is immediately to the west of Russia, and it's bordered by some kind of, I guess, lesser-known countries like Moldova is there, Romania is there, Poland. But they launched this invasion, 5 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, whatever it was. And initially, I guess they thought, I know many of our people thought, that it wasn't going to last very long. Russia has something like 1 million people in its military, something like 3,000 tanks. I've got an article here from BusinessInsider.com. It gives kind of a breakdown of what their military was when they started. So it says 2,840 tanks, 2,600 fixed-wing aircraft, 1,500 helicopters, 500 drones is what they started the fight with. And they launch against Ukraine. Ukraine's got nothing. They've got maybe, 20, 30 planes. They've got not even half of the military. Tanks, nowhere near that many. Helicopters, nowhere near that many. Drones, they've been getting from Turkey over the last few weeks. They didn't have a substantial number of drones either. And so when Russia decided to do this, I mean, the consensus was pretty much, we feel sorry in advance for Ukraine. We're going to put these sanctions in place, even though Russia's going to win the war. We'll try and make it painful for them long term so that maybe they back out or don't go further. There's a lot of different things on the table, but the one thing that was sure, the one thing that was going to happen is that Russia was going to beat the shit out of Ukraine, and we'd have to negotiate with it. Not we necessarily, but NATO, because that alliance literally surrounds Ukraine. All the countries around Ukraine just about are part of NATO. So that's where we thought we were going to be. And 5 weeks later, that's not where things have gone at all. There's estimates of 7,000, 10,000, 15,000 Russians that have been killed so far in just 5 weeks. There were more than 150,000 Russian troops, this article goes on to say, involved with the war in Ukraine, and something like 20,000 are injured. Maybe 15,000 are dead. I mean, there's really no way to exactly know. And so this retired Marine colonel that they interviewed said, you have to keep in mind, this is not the Soviet army of World War II that marched to victory over the bodies of its dead. This is a much smaller army, mostly volunteers, and it's much more sensitive to casualties. It turns out that when they launched this thing, nobody told most of the military what they were actually going to do. It seems like they were told they were going on some exercise, and it turns out that they're fighting a real war. And a lot of these guys are volunteers, and they're young. So they get out there, they're fighting grown fucking men in the Ukrainians who are defending their land, their families, and they're watching their friends get destroyed, slaughtered. 15,000 out of 150, I don't know, depends on where you come from and how you think about it. 10%, it's a fucking lot. And then you're talking about injuries, and you got to think these are war injuries. These are explosions taken off your legs, bullets going through your shoulder, amputations, colostomy bags, losing eyes. We're talking about serious injuries. And you've got the soldiers that aren't injured and aren't dead, but they still have to watch that shit. It reminds me of the tactics that the Vietnamese were using against us. They knew they couldn't win, so they set up a shit ton of booby traps. So if a patrol was happening in the woods, they would dig a hole, and at the bottom of the hole, they would put really sharp sticks. And actually all inside the hole, they would put really sharp sticks, and they had different ways of doing this, but this was one of the more famous, one of the more brutal. And on the sides of the hole, they would put sharp sticks in there too, and they'd cover it up with leaves. So a soldier would be walking, step into this hole, and his entire leg would be just destroyed. But he wouldn't die. The idea from the Vietnamese was, if he screams and suffers long enough, everybody that's fighting with him is going to be afraid, and they're not going to know where to walk next. And we're seeing a lot of that, I think, with these Ukrainians. They're trying to make it as brutal for these Russians as they possibly can. And obviously, it makes sense for them to do that. They're being invaded. But it's not going the way that anybody thought it was going to go. So that same colonel, his name is Mark Kansia, or Kansen, excuse me, and I might be mispronouncing that. He says now they're bringing in new units, and they'll bring in reinforcements to kind of mitigate some of the impact. But he says, but if they keep having casualties at this rate, I don't think they're going to be able to go beyond, say, another 3 weeks. Because apparently people are just not going to want to fight. They've lost something like 300 of those tanks because the Ukrainians are getting weapons from us. They're getting them from the UK. They're getting them from Turkey. And just on and on. It's not going the way that anybody thought it was going to go. And another article from Business Insider, they break the whole thing down into maps. And I'm going to have all the links to these articles so you can go look at this. But they've got this really great series of maps that show a variety of different ways of looking at what's happening. And as you scroll through them, first you see is areas of Ukraine where the Russian military is. And you see that they invaded from the north. They invaded, because north of Ukraine is this country, Belarus, which is very, the government there is very pro-Russian. So they were able to invade through Belarus. They invaded from the east, directly from Russia, and they invaded from the south too, from the sea and from Crimea, which Russia also controls. So they go in from three sides. I mean, the idea here, I mean, clearly the capital of Ukraine, called Kyiv, is in the north, in the middle of the country, and it seems like what they were trying to do is cut the country in half. Keep half for themselves, let the Ukrainians figure out what to do with the other half, and that was going to be it. But they haven't moved. They haven't moved. I mean, they were able to stage a lot of this on the Russian border from these two provinces that really they've been fighting for since 2014. There was these small groups of Russian-speaking people that the Russian government started to support right on the border with Russia, kind of in the southeast of Ukraine, and they're called Donetsk and Luhansk. Luhansk is Luhansk, Donetsk, Donetsk. Really, really cool names. But so Russia goes in, starts supporting these, rebels, quote unquote. Really, they're just stirring up shit because they don't want to lose control of their borders. And they've already lost control of some of them because of NATO. They didn't want this to happen in Ukraine. So they've been fighting in these little provinces, these small, when you look at a map of it, it's maybe a tenth of the country. They're not big, but they were able to stage some of this incursion from these areas. And that's been happening since 2014. But they moved in everywhere. And not only have they moved in, they're shooting missiles from fucking everywhere. They have another map here that shows all the reported missile strikes in Ukraine, and it goes the gambit all the way across the entire country, from one of their port cities, Odessa, in the south, to the capital, Kyiv, in the north, all the way to the east. Not as much when you get west of Kyiv, near Poland, Romania, but just absolutely everywhere. And they're still not winning. Still not winning. This is very un-Russian, as I understood the country to be. Everybody's good at something. I thought Russia was good at fighting wars. Not only have they lost all those soldiers, not only have they lost all this equipment, something like 100 of their, fixed-wing aircraft have been shot down by the fucking Ukrainians. Who thought that they were going to be able to fight back this hard? And you got to respect it. You invade their country. They're seeing apartment buildings getting bombed. One thing about Russian history, the way that they fight, it's about as brutal as you get. Like when they had this little, I'm not going to call it a war, but it's a skirmish between Chechnya, which is a province in Russia. It's a state. Think of Alabama fighting the United States, basically. And so they had it out, and rather than siege and wait it out or have negotiations or, just a myriad of different options that were available to the Russian government, to Putin, he was in charge when this happened, he said, no, fuck it. And he levels the entire capital. And when I say levels, I'm talking not a building standing. If you're in the building, tough shit. Everything completely destroyed. They did the same thing when they were going to help the Syrians a few years back, and they might still be doing it when there were quote-unquote rebels in Syria fighting against the government. They just started shooting missiles into cities, and they have a lot of missiles. And they just continue to shoot them. And they just will turn your entire skyline into nothing. It's kind of incredible when you think about it. I mean, whatever city you live in, I know the podcast we've gotten now, we're at something like 15 different states, maybe 12 different countries, something like that. So you guys that are listening are all over the place. Whatever city you live in, think of the biggest city skyline near you, and it's just gone over a couple of months. And that's what Russia's been trying to do to Ukraine. Not quite to the level of what they did in Chechnya, not quite to the level of what they did in Syria, but could be getting there. They're getting more desperate because they're not winning. I'm not saying they're losing, but they don't seem to be winning. I mean, as of the 21st of March, they had 5 generals get killed. Fucking generals. I mean, the generals we have, if you think back, what do you have? Petraeus, MacArthur. Think of all the guys. 5 of their generals killed in less than a month. In less than a month. Think of how long it takes someone to get to the rank of general. All the experience that you have to have. All the things you've seen. All the problems you've solved. All the answers you already know. All the answers you know won't work. On and on. 5 of them gone. There's a great magazine called Foreign Policy Magazine, and their website has an article on this, and it starts off saying exactly the same thing. Russia's lost at least 5 generals fighting in Ukraine in the last month. Communication failures, lack of discipline among the hundreds of thousands of Russian troops have made it more difficult to communicate orders to the front lines. The tally of Russian generals killed in the month-long conflict, most of them 1- or 2-star commanders, is likely the highest death rate among general officers in the Russian military since World War II. Now, we don't have really great conceptions of time in our country. You know, you say since World War II, whatever. 80 years. It's a really long time. 80 years. And it says actually one of the advisors to the Ukrainian president says it was 6 generals. But what they're saying is that this invading army is fully unprepared for the fight in Ukraine. A lot of these young guys, they don't want to be there from what the reports are. Now, you have to take, I have to take when I'm, talking about this like this. I sound, authoritative, like I know what the fuck I'm talking about. I'm going with the reports that I'm getting. I do try and scour a bit, but I'll tell you this, when you go look at Russian sources, it's not popping champagne bottles. Like, even the propaganda is not really great coming out of Russia, which tells you there's got to be some serious problems. They're kind of hedging their bets. They're like, this is not even an invasion. It's a special military operation. They're keeping the expectations really low, and consistently so. And it's probably because they're fucking struggling. They interviewed for this article, a European diplomat says they're struggling on the front lines to get their orders through. They're having to go to the front lines to make things happen, these generals are, which is putting them at greater risk than you might normally see. So they don't have the experience on the front to even follow the orders. And I guess they're lacking the technology to even get the orders to the front. And that same diplomat said that the Russian death toll among generals, that's like a fifth of all the commanders that they deployed to Ukraine. It's a lack of preparedness among the military. They're asking for things to happen, and they're just not happening. And surprisingly, it goes on to say, while the wars featured almost no ship-to-ship combat, high-ranking naval officers appear to be getting killed in the greatest numbers. Over the weekend, and this article is from late March. So over the weekend, a few weeks ago, a deputy Russian Black Sea Fleet commander was set to be promoted to an admiral, shot dead outside of the city of Mariupol. It's not going well. And so, speaking of the the pro-Russian news outlet side, even they are saying that something like 10,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. And they're acknowledging that these generals have been killed. Very unlike Russia to tell the truth. It must be very true that they can't even deny it. I found another article from Radio Free Europe. The headline is Russia taking incredible losses in Ukraine, says a senior U.S. official, which, look, you have to take those things with a grain of salt, but it's a choir of articles saying basically the same thing. Russia is sustaining incredible losses. I think that, unfortunately, the Russians have not yet fully learned how tough the Ukrainian military is, said U.S. Undersecretary of State. Now, casualty figures are impossible to confirm, but you can make educated guesses. And what might be the worst thing is that the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, who controls everything that country does. And from what I understand, I mean that literally. There isn't any big decisions that are made without his say-so. Almost a dictator, pretty much a dictator, I guess you could say. It seems like up until recently, he was acting like he was getting the wrong information. So it's possible that not only are Russians getting their ass kicked, but the people in charge of telling the boss what's happening don't want to be the ones to tell him that they're getting their ass kicked. So he's making decisions based on possibly faulty information. In the build-up to this invasion, like how can things be going so badly for them? Right? They have a long history of being a military power. They're a huge nuclear power. They've been involved in, dozens and dozens of wars. They make a show of their military. Putin is often talking about some of the latest equipment that they have. And that seems to be where the problem has arisen, is they've spent the last 10, 15, 20 years upgrading equipment, upgrading technology over and over and over again without focusing on basic military, like foundational strategies. Communication between units, for example, is obviously something that's hindering them a lot. Morale, making sure that you have the basic equipment, not great technology and supersonic missiles that can, fly at the fucking speed of light or whatever they're trying to do. Just making sure that your soldiers have the right boots and clothing, foodstuffs, and that they're personally well trained. It seems like they skipped over all that for the last while. And they're paying the price for it. Anybody that's been in any kind of business or really taken on any endeavor, that it is the basics that will make or break you. You could always have to be able to rely on your basics, on your foundation. And it seems to be that's what the Ukrainians have been doing since they've known. I mean, the fight with Russia really started in 2014 for them. And since then, they've been getting their shit together because they've never trusted that this wouldn't go further. And clearly they were right. But they've been getting their shit together, making sure that their guys operate well together as a unit. And that sort of stuff, that camaraderie that builds there, that morale, plus on top of that, you're the defensive force. You're being invaded. Not only are you being invaded, you didn't really fucking do anything. Why have they been invaded? Well, they want to be a part of NATO. Well, no shit, they want to be a part of NATO because they didn't want to have to deal with this invasion ever. So they figured if they could get in with NATO, that would put them under that umbrella. Russia's not going to invade because then they'd have to fight the United States and every other, country in NATO, and that would be a good deterrent for them. Well, that's one of the reasons that they're dealing with this now, is that they tried to do that. They also have tried to get in the European Union. They want to be in that trading bloc. They want to be a more, not necessarily pro-European, but they'd rather do business with Europe than they would with Russia for obvious reasons. So you add all that together, they're being invaded because they tried to do better for themselves. Russia doesn't, it's crab in a bucket type of shit. The old Soviet Union broke down and broke up, and some of the pieces, the countries that have spun off of the Soviet Union, are trying to move on. The divorce is final, and we're going to go find a new spouse, and Russia's just not wanting that to happen. They're just the sick, twisted boyfriend that shows up at your door when you're on date night with new boyfriend. Well, turns out new boyfriend can fucking fight. Turns out new boyfriend ain't to be fucked with. And good for them. The underdog is taking it to him. We have a soft spot for the underdog. I do. There's only so much you can think about these sorts of things. We all have, a life to live. It's not like this is not affected people here and everywhere. Price of oil is the most obvious one, but also people that just pay attention to what's going on in the world. Seeing wars pop out, especially with all the nuclear weapons that are around, it can make you a little, stand up, make you pay attention a little bit. But everybody's rooting for the underdog. Nobody that I saw was saying, Russia's on their way in and boy, I hope they get this over with quick. No. Not only that, one of the great things you saw, speaking, as I did a minute ago about combat sports, some of the great Ukrainian athletes have brought themselves back to Ukraine to fight. I'm thinking of the Klitschko brothers, for example. If you're a boxing fan, there's no way you don't know Vladimir and Vitaly Klitschko. Two phenomenal heavyweight champions of this generation. Just amazing. I think they're between the two of them, they've got to have something like 120 fights. Let me look at this real quick. Between the two of them, they've got 109 wins and only 7 defeats. Okay? And out of those 109 wins, 94 are knockouts. Okay? 46 world title fights between these two brothers. And they are huge men. Both of them, one is the mayor of Kyiv. I'm pretty sure Vladimir is the mayor. I'm not positive about that. But these are extraordinarily wealthy men that do not have to go do this and are there now with bulletproof vests on and fucking helmets waiting for the fighting to happen. Vasily Lomachenko, probably, in my view, an even greater example, only because he is still an active fighter. As a matter of fact, he was about to sign a very lucrative deal to fight for the unified championship against the current champion, George Kambosos, in Australia before this happened. If you follow the sport, then you know that Lomachenko, he was the champion, he lost his titles, and now he was about to have the opportunity to fight to get them back. A fight that he probably would win, in my view. Gave it up, went back to Ukraine, and signed up, and is over there now with an AK-47. Another very wealthy individual who doesn't have to do this, but also apparently doesn't give a fuck. His land, his family, his fight. So these are the underdogs that we've all got the soft spot for, and we should. And it turns out that Russia's not that good at fighting anymore. But they are more of a bully. And I guess that's lucky for the rest of us that as the bullying gets higher, their ability to actually back it up is lesser. So I'm going to keep an eye on this. I hope it doesn't last any longer than it has. There's constantly talks happening, and I imagine those talks are going to accelerate because Russia has more and more reason to get out of this. It doesn't look like they're going to win, quote unquote, whatever that really meant in the beginning, which, who knows what the actual goals were. Maybe they wanted to take over the entire country, so they failed mightily if that was their original goal. If they only wanted to take half of it, they've still failed mightily in that goal. They've been sanctioned by all the major countries, pretty much. I don't think India has. I don't think China has, for a variety of different reasons. But European countries, the United States, a lot of our friends, I guess you could say, around the world have sanctioned them in a variety of ways. And the individuals in Russia, not just the country itself, but a lot of the rich people that live there, a lot of the people that are in the government, even though it's a rubber stamp government that doesn't really have power, you might as well just piss them off. I mean, fuck them. Why not? Which actually, that thought takes me to another story that I saw about alleged Ukrainian war crimes. So there's a lot of stories that have come out and I'm going to link a couple of them. There's some from Reuters, from The Intercept, the New York Times, and the subject of war crimes. And there are dozens and dozens of reports of Russian war crimes, of, there's videos too. Unfortunately, in this age, you can't just trust the videos, but they're there, and I guess at some point we'll find out if they're true, of cars just driving down the highway, they come across a Russian armored vehicle or a tank, and they get blown up or destroyed. I saw one not long ago that basically that. It was a car driving up the highway coming to a turn, and this armored vehicle just destroyed the car. And there was a subsequent video that appeared to go up to that same car after the Russians had left and showed an old couple in there, bodies burned beyond recognition with holes in them. It was just a disgusting scene. So there's a lot of that. And there's also some reports, some videos, some pictures of Ukrainians committing quote-unquote war crimes against Russians. Like there was one that appears to show a Russian soldier with his hands tied behind his back, and this Ukrainian stabbing him in the back, stabbing him in the face, and things like that. There's also other reports of Ukrainian soldiers shooting Russians in the legs that are POWs and things like that. I don't know if any of those are true. What I do know, though, and I respect the idea of preventing war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocides, killing of civilians, and all this. I respect all of that. And I think it has a place in our world community. But I also will say that if you're on the Ukrainian side of this and you think through where they've been, what they've been trying to do, and what has happened to them as a result. So just recap of Ukraine is older than Russia, for one, okay? And this part of the world has a really long memory. So Ukraine is older than Russia. When Ukraine had fairly modern cities, Russia was a fucking forest, okay? So that's where this all started. And then they've had to hear over the years from this particular President Putin that, in fact, their country's not even real. So you start there. Then you have this invasion in First of all, you have Crimea, which was a part of Ukraine that was stolen from them by Russia. I think that happened in 2009 or so. I don't quote me on that year. Then in 2014, further invasion of these two provinces we were talking about, Donetsk and Luhansk. So they've had pieces of their country, possibly places where some of these soldiers, these Ukrainian soldiers, grew up, where their grandmothers might have houses. I don't know. Pieces of their country taken. So we can visualize this as if, Brazil came up and just took that bottom part of Florida. Not the panhandle, but just the part, the peninsula of Florida. They just occupied that. So that's kind of the beginning of this. So if you're a self-respecting Ukrainian, you're already fairly livid at what you're forced to deal with, but you don't, fight too much because you don't want this fight. This is not a fight you're picking. You don't want this fight. So you just, you turn the other cheek. You turn the other cheek. And then you get invaded anyway. And actually, take a step back. This fighting that's been happening since 2014, something like 60,000 Ukrainians have been killed in that fighting alone. So you're seeing your friends, your brothers, your sisters get slaughtered, get killed by these fucking Russians that are on your land, that are in your country. So then they launch this further and they say, you know what? None of that is enough. It's not enough that we took this piece of your country. It's not enough that we are currently taking this piece of your country. We're taking the whole thing. And I understand that some of these Russian soldiers didn't know what they were signing up for. I hear you. I get it. But I'm looking at it from the Ukrainian side. And so, if some Russian soldiers were tied up, and take this awful video, actually. Fuck that. Take this awful video that I just described to you. You've got one soldier on the ground, sitting, hands tied behind his back, or cuffed, or whatever. You've got another soldier standing with a knife, stabs this guy in the back, leans him over, puts the knife directly through his eye socket. If it turns out that that video is true, if it turns out that those Ukrainians are doing that on purpose, the same way the Vietnamese did, to scare the rest of the Russian soldiers so that they don't want this fight anymore, I'm not sure I can call that a war crime. You know? I'd be curious what y'all think about that. When you take the whole thing in context, okay? This was not some war that started because both sides were picking at each other. This has been a one-sided bullying strategy from the beginning. How much are you supposed to take? How much are you supposed to deal with? How many of these soldiers have had their kids murdered by falling missiles? These missiles have been hitting apartment buildings, hospitals. How much of that are you supposed to do before you start to get desperate and say, you know what, I'm going to do anything I have to make this stop, including, hey, hold this phone, record this shit. I don't know. I don't know what I would do in that situation. What would you do? What would you be willing to do? And what would you not feel any remorse for? I don't know. I'm going to keep up with it, and I will report back if it seems warranted. But I appreciate you taking some time to listen. I'll be back soon with another Best Idea episode. I hope everything's going well for everybody, and I'll see you next time.